Sponsored by Henson Shaving. Hello my beautiful watchers, and welcome to Lost in Adaptation. Herein we talk about adaptations of books regarding how well they tied into their source material and the consequences of the changes they made. You is a psychological suspense thriller with the semi-unique twist that the story is told from the highly delusional perspective of the stalker-murderer instead of the victim, chronicling his immediate fixation on a woman after they meet and his subsequent invasive surveillance and manipulation of her life to guarantee a relationship with her. It was the first work of fiction by Caroline Kepnes, an American writer and former entertainment reporter. The book's written in a weird mix of first and second person, as the entire thing is formatted as the deranged bastard pretending to address his victim and describe his actions and feelings towards her. As a result, every third sentence starts with the word you, which helps explain why Kepnes insisted on such a search engine optimization nightmare of a title for her book. Reading this book is a intentionally stressful experience, and not just because of the suspense regarding who's going to live or die. Kepnes is an absolute genius at juxtaposing language with wildly conflicting events. The whole book is written using the same flowery terminology as your average romance book, while describing the most foul and unconscionable behavior imaginable. Reading about someone affectionately thinking about their partner and all the cute, crazy things being in love makes you do while they're bashing a love rival's head in with a rock is unsettling. Kepnes is also so good at writing realistic toxic masculinity, I kept having to fight the urge to double check that she was actually a woman and not a male author with a misleading pen name. Kepnes is also disturbingly talented at tricking you into temporarily actually relating to or rooting for the morally reprehensible lead, resulting in constant uncomfortable moments of realization that actually yes, you do want him to get discovered when he's caught in someone's house. It's partly just our programmed habit of rooting for the POV character of any story. We've all read and watched hundreds, maybe thousands of stories where the protagonist automatically equals the hero. That's the general default, so you have to constantly fight that instinct when the lead is suddenly the unquestionable villain of the piece. But it's not just that, it's also her genius way of mixing more grounded issues in with the criminally insane ones. Hopefully none of us can relate to kidnapping one's love rival and murdering them in a basement, but we absolutely can understand the stress of waiting for a terminal committophobe with communication issues to text back. So you find yourself being constantly drawn into the relatable aspects before being reminded yet again that this son of a bitch is a literal serial killer. Comparing this book to Dexter, the most popular example of the premise, is somewhat inevitable if you're even a little familiar with those books or TV show adaptation. My personal opinion is that while Dexter's influence on the story is unmissable, a key difference is the writers of Dexter use things like his surprisingly good nature outside of the serial killing and unbendable moral code to make a genuine attempt to make him out to be an anti-hero, while Kepnes absolutely does not want you to like her protagonist in any way, and only makes you occasionally relate to him to fuck with you. Anyways, the book developed a not inconsiderable following, and Kepnes would go on to write 3 sequel novels starring the same character. You eventually caught the eye of the Lifetime cable channel, who bought the adaptation rights in April 2017. Sarah Gamble, Greg Berlanti, and Leslie Morgenstein, all experienced TV and film writer-producers, were appointed as showrunners and apparently handled the majority of the screenplay adapting, though several other writers were listed for individual episodes, including Kepnes, who was brought on to contribute to episode 8. Penn Badgley was apparently quite hesitant to accept the role for pretty obvious stalkery, serial killery reasons, but was eventually convinced and was joined by Elizabeth Lail as his character's victim. The show received some pushback on release for glorifying obsessive stalking behavior, which is interesting because that's definitely not something you could accuse the book of. Something clearly happened in the writing process. Let's talk adaptation. Okay, the following is what was described in the book, or close enough to it to make no difference. The meet-cute, in as heavy a quotation marks as possible, between Joe Goldberg and Guinevere Beck, who just goes by Beck in his independent bookstore. Joe's immediate e-stalking of her being made easy by Beck's intense social media oversharing. Joe being mildly perturbed that she didn't immediately tweet about the hot bookstore owner she met, but persisting in tracking down her apartment and watching her through her windows. also made easy by her lack of curtains and habit of walking around naked half the time. His stalking revealing to him that she's in a toxic relationship with a rich douche bro called Benji, who continuously takes advantage of her and treats her like crap. Using a false gas leak emergency to gain access to her house, which almost gets him discovered. Beck imbibing too much after a public poetry reading and falling onto some subway tracks, giving Joe a chance to ingratiate himself to her by rescuing her and steal her phone for more effective stalking. Oh, by the way, there's a cage in Joe's bookstore's basement for storing rare novels that his former boss and father figure occasionally locked him in when he made mistakes. Joe kidnapping Benji and keeping him in said cage for a bit before murdering him using his extreme peanut allergy. Joe's stalking leading him to discover that Beck is still bonking other guys well in the early stages of starting a relationship with him. Accompanying Beck on a bed buying and construction trip, though the implied reward of testing its stability together is interrupted by Beck's friend Peach, who uses fake chronic illness to monopolize Beck's attention as she's secretly in love with her. When Joe and Beck finally do get the chance to bump uglies, Joe becoming what I believe is commonly referred to as a one-pump chump, much to his distress and humiliation. Doubling down on his stalking and believing that Beck has entered into a sugar daddy arrangement with an older man who turns out to actually be her regular daddy, which is surprising because she claimed he was dead. Feeling that Peach's constant attempts to control Beck infringes on his copyright, Joe attempting to bash her brain out with a rock while she's jogging in Central Park, only to discover he didn't get them all the way out, and Peach capitalizing on her recovery to isolate Beck from him and whisk her away to her summer house. Joe getting startled by a deer while following her there and crashing his car. Peach attempting to seduce Beck and failing, and Joe finishing what he started regarding, her murder. Joe and Beck getting serious again and dubbing their relationship an everything ship. Beck starting to pull away emotionally and physically after starting therapy, convincing Joe that she's having an affair with her therapist, but approaching said therapist under a false identity, leading him to actually benefiting from therapy. Joe briefly dating another woman named Karen during the breakup part of their breakup period, but leaving her for Beck when the first opportunity arises. It turning out that Beck was in fact banging her therapist. Yikes. Beck finding Joe's stalker box full of her panties and other items that he stole from her, and proof that he murdered Benji and Peach. Joe locking her in his book cage to stop her from telling anyone in the hopes that he can talk her into understanding how super justified and good intentioned his serial killing actions were. Beck unsuccessfully attempting to escape and avoid the same fate as her friends, and Joe framing her horny therapist for her murder. The book's iconic juxtaposition is recreated extremely well in the show. From start to finish, everything from the warm lighting to the bright color tones to the classical music constantly tells you that you are watching a romantic story while Joe does the most unhinged criminal shit imaginable. This constant conflict of tone versus events gives the watcher the same continuous sense of discomfort as the book gave its readers. This is a relatively minor thing, but in both versions, Peach's privilege as a person of wealth and influence is conveyed by making her a semi-close relation of J.D. Salinger. It's not as blatantly wild as Field of Dreams, but seriously, why do people keep dragging famously reclusive and combative author J.D. Salinger into their stories? Everything in the TV show happens just slightly out of the original chronological order. Like everything. Nothing happens in the same timeline as the book. When he saved her from the train tracks, when he kidnapped Benji, when he assaulted Peach, the father incident, the everything ship. None of them are wildly out of sequence, but nothing is in sequence. Because this reordering is consistent but not huge, the general story survives it mostly intact. No huge deviation from the book occurs because of it. It gave me a slight headache while I tried to keep it all straight in my head. Relatively speaking, and I am for sure not saying you're supposed to like Joe in the show, but relative to the character in the book, he's definitely more likable. Despite Book Joe's insistence that he was constantly the very embodiment of charm, and that he and Beck were, when circumstances allowed, having an idyllic, perfect, passionate relationship, if you pay attention to what he's actually describing before he converts it on his head to fit his warped reality, reality, you can tell that every single interaction he ever has with her was actually kind of awkward and lackluster. Book Joe is the kind of person who genuinely mistakes politeness for intense sexual chemistry and pity laughter for a sign that he's dazzling the room. The show, however, portrays these things exactly how he was imagining them. He actually is immensely charismatic, and if you're not aware of what he's doing in the background, the times that he and Beck were a couple do appear to be relationship goals. He encourages and inspires her with her dream of becoming a writer, and they're frickin' cute as feck together. At first I thought the show might have been going for an unreliable narrator kind of thing, but when the POV switches to Beck or another character, nothing really changes, so I guess not. While this does represent a deviation from the book, it's not entirely without value. The intense disparity between how Joe acts around people and what he's doing in secret is much more jarring in this version, which can be significantly creepier, especially with how hard the show commits to it. In addition to all this, on-screen Joe's commitment to convincing himself that all of his actions are justified, romantic, and selfless is less absolute. The slightest hint of the possibility that he's doing anything wrong never ever enters Book Joe's mind zone. Everything he does is 100% perfect. He has done nothing wrong ever in his life. By the start of this book, he's clearly been practicing the daily mental gymnastics required to maintain this belief so often it's become effortless for him. In comparison, you get the impression that Shoujo is somewhat more self-aware of the immorality of his behavior. He's accepted that he has darkness within him that he can't control, but he's capable of feeling guilt for it sometimes, even if that doesn't stop him.
It's all starting to feel a little dirty, because I'm not doing it for you anymore. I'm doing it for me.
A partial reason for this could be practical as well as creative. The amount of voiceover required to convey the before-mentioned mental gymnastics would drown out the rest of the show. There would never be any time for dialogue or visual storytelling. The entire thing would just be Joe talking to himself. On top of that, well, let's face it, Penn Badgley being a gorgeous son of a bitch is also a factor in this version of the character being less hateable. It's not in any way, shape or form new information that people forgive fictional hotties for everything up to and including murder. Although it's not implicitly stated in the first novel, one has to assume that Book Joe is reasonably good looking, or he'd never be as successful as women as he was considering his intense lack of riz. But it's one thing for it to be implied that someone's handsome, and another to have it right in front of you in 4K. As much as Joe is improved upon in this show, Beck probably outdoes him regarding being more sympathetic on screen. Obviously, I'm about to be a little hyperbolic here, as one of the other options is a literal serial killer, but Book Beck is the absolute worst. She is a vain, shallow, pretentious, narcissistic, insecure, lazy, validation-seeking, codependent, attention-hungry, self-sabotaging, amoral, performative, pathological liar who fetishizes wealth and has severe confused sexual feelings about her absentee father. Honestly, an ironic twist of the book is that it would take someone as delusional as Joe to idealize someone as genuinely shitty as her. Now, obviously, I am not saying that this in any way makes her deserve what Joe did to her. Her failings were social and personality based, none of which is a crime nor deserving of punishment. It's just wild how much I would not want to be friends with her in real life. If Joe wasn't an actual monster, I might have felt sorry for him the way she treated him and others. The show clearly wanted a more likable Beck, so the audience would become emotionally invested in her ultimately doomed fate, and I mean, yeah, I get the logic there. Moving on to generalities, there's more ironic humor thrown into the show as people constantly joke about stalking and obsessive behavior, ignorant of Joe's active participation in it. Now, while I would ultimately defend the book from the Dexter ripoff accusations, that's harder to do with the show. A lot of the meat of your average Dexter episode was him dealing with the practical elements of murder and body disposal, and the unexpected problems that arise from that, often with a morbidly comedic overtone. It was borderline suspiciously convenient just how easy it was for Joe to get away with things like transporting and cremating Benji in the novel. It's casually described post hoc in just a few sentences. It's just not the focus of the story. It's way more about the stalking than the pitfalls of illicit body disposal. But in the show, he ends up forced to cart Benji's body around in his trunk all day as he's pressured into pausing mid-disposal to do favors for Beck and Peach. Beck then calls him to have a serious talk about the relationship while he's literally trying to set the body on fire, and a couple that was probably out dogging immediately walks up on his corpse barbecue the second he lights it. The list of murder cover-up shenanigans just goes on and on in the show, and they all have the same weird, humorous vibe as Dexter.
Pro tip of the day, screen your calls when you're trying to burn a body, because it turns out things slip out that you didn't actually want to say.
Harsh.
One of the single biggest deviations from the book, plot-wise, was the introduction of some entirely show-original characters, i.e. Joe's problematic neighbors and their son Paco. It's quickly revealed that Paco's mother is a drug addict and his stepfather is an abusive alcoholic. Because of this, Joe takes Paco under his wing, making sure he doesn't go hungry and getting him out of the building during the loudest fights and/or makeup sessions. Paco and his family play pretty major roles in almost every episode, absorbing events assigned to other characters in the book and adding unique subplots that run parallel to Joe and Beck's stalk relationship. It's a pretty obvious case of the pet the cat trope and an effective way to really hammer in the show's take on Joe, that in every other way, in all the things that don't involve his criminal insanity regarding women, he's a genuinely good dude, ? It's like he's two different people in one. Genuinely caring about this kid and looking out for him with no ulterior motive is not something Book Joe would ever have done. Paco's plight wouldn't have even registered in his mind zone unless involving himself in it played into manipulating Beck in some way. This sub-arc culminates in Joe murdering Paco's stepfather to save him, yet another seemingly selfless act, then Paco returning the favor by abandoning Beck to her doom so she couldn't incriminate his savior, binding them together forever in their shared secrets. The effect that these newcomers had on the plot is pretty significant, but they don't derail it completely. A lot of the whys and hows look different now, but the destination was ultimately the same. The show shares the POV in a way the book did not. Beck even takes over the narration every now and again to cover entirely not Joe-related struggles, like sexual harassment from her tutors, encouraging us to invest in her even more as a character. Like every other frickin' plot point, the kidnapping of Benji took place out of the original order of events, happening much sooner and sparing the audience several more examples of him ruining Beck's life with his casual, neglectful treatment of her. The show establishes that he's a massive douche pretty effectively, and there are some examples of his bad treatment of Beck, but you don't get the same sense of just how many times she chose him over Joe, and how clear it was that this would go on indefinitely if nothing was done. As a result, Shoujo's decision to capture and murder him seems impulsive and rushed. As usual, I am not saying that the reasons he had for getting him out of the way so fatally were justified in the book, but they were at least more understandable if you take his twisted sociopathic logic into account. I noticed that the show seemed to be taking care to avoid depicting graphic violence against women in particular. Both times that Joe attacks Peach, the camera cuts or pans away at the key moment, and Beck's abduction and death happen entirely off screen. I can see why they might have felt they needed to handle male violence towards women a little more carefully, considering the entire premise of the show is already playing dangerously close to triggering real experiences for many women, though I don't know, it's just a little funny that they're so tactful about that, but apparently fine with showing Benji getting whammed by a hammer and Joe getting his face rearranged by his neighbor in all its bloody glory. Again, I am just observing this, not complaining about it. The description of Beck's murder was both extremely graphic and viscerally disturbing in the book, so I wasn't looking forward to seeing it play out on screen. There's a bunch of what I would call forgivable plot convenience in the book, combined with what appears to be, and my genuine apologies to Caroline Kepnes if I'm misjudging her here, a mild lack of understanding of how certain technology works. For example, to justify Joe being able to monitor her every communication, Beck, a 24-year-old social media addict, was written to have an inexplicable aversion to texting or any sort of related app, insisting on sending all of her messages, including group chats, via email. Kepnes also wrote in a convoluted explanation for why Beck doesn't cancel her old phone plan after Joe stole it, explaining that she didn't want to admit to her mother, who was paying the bill, that she'd lost another phone, so buys an entirely new plan and phone, and allows her mother to continue pointlessly paying for the lost one indefinitely. And as convenient a plot point as that is, I'm more confused as to why Kepnes thought that Joe would need access to a phone with its original activated SIM card to monitor emails. This apparent belief that you need to own the physical hardware to access inboxes comes up again towards the end, when Joe uncovers Beck's affair and learns that because she was becoming justifiably paranoid that her boyfriend had hacked her emails, her therapist lover had bought her an entirely new secret laptop so she could have a new secret email address that Joe didn't know about. Again, that's a whole new secret laptop for a new email address. Now, admittedly, when the book was written in 2014, smartphones had only been commonplace for a few years, and I'm aware that I am holding this work of fiction to a pretty high standard of technological accuracy, but considering that the inherent vulnerability of cyber communication is a key part of the cautionary tale, I feel like a little more research into how any of it works might have been appropriate. The TV show, written and set in 2018, shows a lot more awareness of how phones work. Beck replaces her SIM card, which deactivates the lost one, and the convenient hand-waving of cybersecurity actually has an element of truth to it, as they now invoke the cloud.
You think you're also deactivating your old one, but here's where you're wrong. Your old phone, which I have, is still logged into the cloud. And that means I'm still logged into you.
Which, depending on what phone Beck has and if she really did partake in zero security measures, is not impossible. However, and I'm aware that I'm descending into extreme realms of nitpicking here, I have to point out that when you get a quick look at the not quite an iPhone because villains aren't allowed to use iPhone screen, you can see that Joe has supposedly found a strong Wi-Fi connection on a random residential street in New York and is still connected to the mobile network. Something that, ironically, one would need an activated SIM card for. And this is more amusing than actual plot hole, but Joe mentally gives Beck a hard time for not password protecting her phone, but 7 episodes later, you can clearly see that he doesn't either. On the plus side, instead of the secret laptop, Joe's temporary blindness to Beck's goings-on in the climax comes about from him destroying his copy of her phone during one of his more therapy-induced lucid moments. Then, when he relapses, he uncovers the truth by mugging the therapist for his phone and accessing their communications from that end of it, none of which I can poke any holes in. The show tries to insert just a little hint of moral justification for the murders of Benji and Peach. In a futile attempt to earn his freedom, Benji offers Joe potential blackmail on him, which turns out to be footage of him committing manslaughter by hazing a young gay man to death. And Peach is revealed to be violating Beck's privacy almost as much as Joe, and is now actively sabotaging her career in the hopes that this will encourage her to leave it all behind and move to Paris with her. The book makes no attempt to villainize Joe's victims in a criminal way, though amusingly it still achieves the same if not greater level of reader ambivalence towards their deaths through the sheer power of just how annoying these characters are. You know when a fictional character is just so unbearably irritating you're happy they've been written out of the story, even if it was via death? Obviously you'd never want someone to get murdered in real life, but within the confines of the fiction, you're really not too bummed about it. That's the vibe of pretty much every death in the book, with the possible exception of Beck's. Anyways, let's round things off with some minor but reasonably interesting changes. Peach went by Peaches in the book because of a douchey play on words with her middle name. I only mention this because the show drew attention to the fact that they weren't doing this.
This is a lovely collection, Peaches.
It's Peach.
The cage was a literal cage in the book. It was just for protecting the most expensive books from theft, as opposed to the Vatican Archive-style glass mini biome they made it in the show. Book Joe's car was pretty badly wrapped around a tree when he crashed it, but I guess the show either didn't have the budget or the guts to damage a 1968 Buick Skylark because it's miraculously unharmed after a headlong collision with an embankment, not even a dent. Ethan, Joe's employee at the bookstore, is 2 characters combined into one. Joe eventually fired Book Ethan for being terrible at his job and giving Beck his home address, which nearly resulted in her finding all of the belongings that he'd stolen. Ethan got revenge a little later by rounding up a posse of friends to beat the living piss out of Joe, which he apparently took as some sort of weird cleansing of his sins event, so wasn't upset about it. Joe's a bit of a weirdo, shocking revelation, I know. Ethan's replacement was the one who ended up engaged to Beck's friend Blanche. Seeing as Joe's beatdown had already been reassigned to a show original character, I can see the logic in not bothering to replace Ethan. The show introduces an entire episode's worth of new plot about Beck deciding that she wants Joe back after seeing him in a happy relationship with someone else, and descending into nearly Joe levels of stalking to achieve it. I am certain a big shocker for fans of the book was the last-second sequel bait reveal that Joe's significant ex Candace is alive despite the heavy implication that he'd murdered her. It's the exact opposite in the book, wherein the twist is that he did indeed kill her when she tried to break up with him. Kepnes was very careful to write Joe's internal monologue regarding her to give no hints about this before the reveal. This was made pretty easy by Joe's genuine belief that nothing is ever his fault, up to and including killing people, so he always thought about Candace in terms of her letting him down and leaving him. At the end of the book, a new attractive young woman catches Joe's eye in a the cycle begins again kind of way. It's pretty dark. It's kind of funny that they had to debrand IKEA into something generic in this show, as it being IKEA was a plot point in the book because of Joe's romantic expectations of what going there was going to be like based on watching 500 Days of Summer, and Beck's clear resentment that having to shop there would reflect on her relatively low social class. Related, their time in IKEA is a prime example of how the show made what was clearly an extremely awkward and depressing event that Joe was running through his mental rose-tinted revisionism in real time into exactly what he was hallucinating it to be. It became a romantic, sexually charged outing with lots of charming, witty banter. In the book, he spent the entire trip obsessing over a red ladle that Benji had mentioned and becoming increasingly resentful and infuriated that Beck wasn't sharing the same story with him, culminating in his very unsubtly dragging her to the utensils section after several uncomfortable exchanges about it. Something that bothered me about the book was thankfully omitted from the show. Joe steals a very recognizable hat from Benji after killing him, and the writing reminds you that he's occasionally sporting this proof of murder multiple times in later chapters. Now, I assumed that this was cocking a pretty high caliber Chekhov's gun regarding how Beck was going to get wise to Joe being a bad murder baby, but no, the hat's suspense just fizzles out, and Beck eventually finds, well, literally every other piece of evidence instead. There's kind of a parallel for this in the show when Joe takes Benji's watch, but it actually has some payoff as Peach recognizes it just before her death. I don't want to dwell on this for, well, it being gross reasons, but the green pillow that Beck uses to pleasure herself on the regular is revealed to have been her father's neck pillow in the book, and one of the few things that he requested be delivered to him when he abandoned his family. Oh, that girl has so many issues. Oh, the issues. She has all the issues. The show adds the rather morbid final twist that Beck came up with the idea for how to frame her lover for her own murder. She intended it as a way to talk Joe out of killing her, but obviously it played out rather differently. Final thoughts. So, it's the same general story, but different characters acting it out, making Joe so much less frustrating and horrifying to be in the head of, and Beck, not the biggest douchebag in any given room, has a considerable knock-on effect on the rest of the plot, but I guess they end up in the same general places at the end. It's hard to say if the show version of Joe is more nuanced or just more Dexter influenced than before. The producers straight up admitted they ripped Dexter off regarding how they integrated the voiceover into the show. And as mentioned at the start, making him more likable, even in a weird Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde way, led some people to feel that the show crossed the line into endorsing his behavior in some way. So between that and the constant reordering of events, I don't know, it comes out pretty middle of the road adaptation-wise. Not great, not terrible. Lifetime ended up cancelling the show after just one season, but it was almost immediately picked up by Netflix and went on to run for a total of 5. Adaptation-wise, Season 2 took a pretty hard nosedive regarding book accuracy, only very loosely sticking to certain elements of the sequel novel's plot, and from Season 3 onwards they diverged completely. No remnants of the book series remained in the show. One detail I was fascinated to learn is that Shoujo is eventually caught and faces the consequences of his actions, something that's yet to happen in the book series, though I hope it does eventually. It would be a lot easier to digest his vileness if I knew he'd eventually burn for it. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers. This episode was made because of an official request on my Patreon page. If you're interested in that sort of thing, or any other reward tiers, be sure to check that out, and let's all agree to go turn on two-factor authorization on all of our apps, okay? Yeah, let's just do that. You know, there really isn't an effective segue between a TV show about stalking and this episode's sponsor, which, if you think about it, is a good thing. So, this is me changing the subject. Have you ever wondered what you'd get if the guys who manufacture the parts for space probes and the Mars rovers put their minds towards helping people shave better? Okay, well, me neither, but the result is still pretty awesome. Behold the Henson Razor. Actual aerospace engineers have used their big old brains to design something that puts the traditional multi-blade razors that we've all just accepted are necessary for a close shave to shame, while being less expensive in the long run and 100% recyclable. You know what's funny? I didn't actually have to start shaving until I was in my 20s. I was a bit of a late bloomer when it came to big boy hair. Anyway, most companies will try to screw you by selling a moderately priced razor, then charge extortionate amounts for the replacement heads, like each one will cost you around $2. Henson doesn't do that, the blades are like 10 cents each. And an aerospace engineer amount of thought really has gone into the design of this. The blade is completely locked in and supported across its entire length, except for the 0.0013 inches that extends at a perfect 30-degree angle, which is an exceptionally nerdy flex, but it makes for an incredible shave. I am big into the sustainability aspect of this. Over 2 billion plastic razors enter landfills each year in the US alone, so I'm pretty stoked to not be contributing to that anymore and looking fabulous doing it. Check out the link and code in the video description to get 100 free blades when you purchase. That's at least a year's worth, even for my more hairily endowed friends.